Hi, I'm Lindsay Grant. I'm from the School of Education at the University of Bristol. I'd like to start by thanking the organisers for inviting me to participate in this online colloquium associated with the Doing Data Differently project. This is a really fantastic conversation to be part of, and I'm looking forward to the live panel discussion next week too. So in this talk, what I want to focus on is how data practices in schools and in education more generally are used to predict futures for pupils and to preempt those futures, and what that means for individuals and what that means in terms of fairness, and then broaden that conversation out a little bit to think about how educational data is used in different ways to define and calculate what counts as fairness, and how we might think of fairness as contested and produced differently through different kind of data arrangements. And I'll be coming on to talk about the recent debacle about algorithmic predictions of exam results over the summer in England. But first, I want to say a few words about futures and about fairness and about how we think about these ideas. So, thinking about fairness, one of the important elements of what we generally consider to be fair is that futures are open to something new, that we are not determined by what has gone before, that we have some agency, but also that there might be some chance and some surprise, that the past does not entirely determine the future, that there is some openness towards unpredictability that's important to our ideas of what might be a fair educational outcome. And this seems to relate to ideas from Biesta around the importance of openness and open futures in any kind of meaningful understanding of what education is. So he argues that for education to be education and not simply reproduce what has gone before, that we must remain open to the formation of new beginners, that learners need to be able to take up new ideas in perhaps unpredictable ways to generate new kinds of subjectivities for themselves. And that education must also be open to new beginnings, that is, the development of new knowledge that cannot be determined in advance. Otherwise, education is simply the reproduction of what has gone before. We might call it, a kind of limited version of training. It's not really something that's educational if we know exactly how it's going to proceed before we even start. So this radical openness to unpredictability and to risk, and of course also to the possibility of failure, is for Biesta the very condition of possibility for education to happen at all. And of course, what we see around data practices in schools and education more generally is often an attempt to remove any risk of failure through attempting to predict exactly what will happen in the future. So the research that I'm drawing on in this talk is a socio-material ethnography of a secondary school in England. And so what I explored in this school over the course of a year was how the educational data apparatus performed ways of knowing, ways of doing education. So the ways that people thought about what education was, what learning was, what the role of a teacher was, what the role of a pupil was, what the curriculum meant and was for. And I followed the social life of data. So that was documents, that was computer programs, that was conversations, that was interviews, that was committee meetings, that was a lot of reports that circulated throughout the school and into and out of the school over the course of a single year. So this school wasn't particularly unique, wasn't particularly special. They were very keen on data, but that's nothing unusual. And I see this school as a kind of entry point into this kind of wider network of data flows, this material, semiotic and social flows and practices that were present within this single school, but also present throughout the education system at international and micro levels. So one of the elements of that research that I want to draw on here is from the school's data office, and this picture here is the pupil postcard wall. And you can see on the top right image here, a little postcard of a pupil with some letters and numbers, both printed and scribbled on, representing some important data about that individual. And the position of that postcard on the wall was also very significant because it represented the priority of that pupil in receiving additional interventions to attempt to boost their scores in English and maths particularly. This data was collected in 2015, and since then the English education system has a slightly different accountability setup, and GCSE exams are graded slightly differently, but there is still plenty of these kind of data practices going on in schools. So speaking to the data manager about what this setup was all about, she explained to me that it was a way of identifying and intervening with the right children. So the calculation that is shown in that picture on the bottom right of the screen there was a bespoke algorithm that the school had developed in order to determine pupils' priorities. And the way that this algorithm worked was to identify which pupils were likely to be near misses across multiple targets. So the school had targets which were passed on to children for pupils to achieve a certain grade, a C grade as it was then, in English and maths, their attainment targets. They also had progress targets where they had to progress by a certain amount between the end of primary school and the end of secondary school. And pupils who were in receipt of pupil premium funding, which is used to provide additional support for pupils from disadvantaged backgrounds, low socioeconomic backgrounds, families in receipt of certain welfare benefits. They also had targets for the achievement and progress of those pupils. So this algorithm was intended to triage pupils to identify who should receive interventions to push them over the target boundary. So the way it worked was to identify which pupils were near misses. So if a pupil had a target of a C and they were predicted to get a D in multiple target areas, they would be a high priority. If that pupil was predicted to get a G, it's going to completely fail, they would not be a high priority because those intervention classes would be unlikely to boost them over the grade threshold. So it was about triaging those pupils who were seen as worthy of investing more time and resource through intervention classes. And what also happened to those pupils who were identified and placed in intervention classes is they had to drop other subjects. So their curriculum narrowed in order to do extra booster classes in English and maths. So usually arts, usually sports subjects. And because this system was based on data, it was seen as a more objective and a fairer system for identifying pupils than one that was based more on teachers' judgments. Okay, so there was this theme about data being automatically fairer and human judgments automatically less so. And that was what happened in the data office, but this system spread out everywhere in the school. So what I saw was that following the data back out of the data office into the classroom practice was configured around the demands of the data system. So what we saw was frequent formal testing of pupils. One teacher said to me this was a ridiculously powerful number of assessments that had increased dramatically from previous years, giving them a huge amount of knowledge about pupils that they hadn't had before. Every single lesson in English was focused on practicing performance on target assessment criteria. So the same teacher described this as English as the government wants it to be taught and as defined through those assessment criteria. Anything not on those assessment criteria was seen as not teaching English. And at a school level, there was this system-wide dashboard for monitoring how on target the school was to meet its accountability targets. So what all this seemed to add up to was what we could call an anticipatory data logic. So Vincan Adams describes this as a situation in which the present is governed at almost every scale, as if the future is what matters most. And Dave Beer picks this up with the idea that these kind of anticipatory data logics work to shape not just what is probable, but what is possible. So he's talking about how this isn't just about using data to talk about, well, something is more or less likely, but that by doing so, we actually change the course of what might be possible at all. So in the school, this anticipation of data futures shaped the pupils' present in quite strong ways. So their curricular access, whether they had a broad curriculum or whether they had to drop arts and sports subjects in order to take additional English and maths classes, that might have been the right choice for many pupils, but that discussion was not possible to have. Working from the probabilities of whole cohorts, if a pupil had achieved a certain grade at the end of primary school, to predict into the future what their target was for the end of secondary school, was all based on averages and then applied to individual pupils. So this past data was used to predict future outcomes that were then applied back again to individual pupils. These logics can be seen to limit opportunities for other priorities to inform decisions. So the pupils' own interests and ambitions, their present concerns, became unimportant. And there were limited opportunities to imagine futures outside a very limited range of possibilities. So the only real question was whether a pupil would get a C or a D, or perhaps in current times a 9 or a 7. Okay, the other possibilities for pupils' futures were not possible to have conversations about in this data world. So data in school was seen as providing objective evidence for fair decisions, which maps onto final exam outcomes. So a lot of the drive for using data in the school was put down to formal tests, provide scientific evidence that is free of human bias. But I think what the Ofqual controversy showed us recently was a great illustration, was how the idea of fairness as enacted through data is far from a straightforward and simple one. And I think it raises some interesting questions about how fairness is calculated, described, defined, and the role of data in those different ideas of fairness. So many of you will be familiar with the news over the summer as students who were not able to take their exams due to the COVID-19 pandemic had their A-level results calculated by an algorithm determined by Ofqual, which, as was described in the news, downgraded many students' results from their teacher assessments. And the bigger picture here, the argument that students were making and many educationalists were making, was that this algorithm enacted substantial unfairness and substantial injustice, as pupils from more disadvantaged schools were much more likely to have their teacher assessments adjusted downwards than those from smaller private schools, because of the way that the algorithm worked to prioritise past data and was more difficult to apply to smaller schools with smaller cohorts and subjects with more limited exam entry. They just didn't have the data to apply the algorithm in those situations. So what does this mean for how we think about fair data futures? So I think what we can see is that fairness is enacted through data based on a messy process of political priorities, through making compromises, and through building consensus or failure to do so, as I think we saw with the Ofqual example. So it might be worth thinking a little bit about what kinds of data and what kinds of data practices different ideas of fairness prioritised. So the off-qual algorithm prioritised as most important fairness between different cohorts and between schools. So it was seen as unacceptable that the cohort of 2020 would have a higher average grade than previous years. And so they applied the data from previous years to determine an average, which they used to predict how schools and subjects would perform in 2020, and then fitted students to that prediction. Okay, and the cost of that, of course, was the possibility of creating new futures for individual pupils or for individual schools to deviate from a future that had been predicted by that past data. What was quite interesting to me was the idea that assessments had been downgraded from teacher assessments. So teacher assessments were seen to be, in a lot of the argument, the more accurate, perhaps the more real measure of students' performance. And of course, teacher assessments prioritise different kinds of data. They prioritise their teachers' professional knowledge. They also prioritise teachers' assessment of students' work in informal situations. And what we tend to think about teacher assessment of future exam performance is that they think of that student in terms of the best case scenario, how that student would do on a good day. So teacher assessments on average tend to be above exam results, hence off-qual's concern with going with teacher assessments alone. And before the exams were announced, students were actually really worried about this. My colleagues Lucy Wenham and Claire Lee talked to students who were very anxious about teacher favouritism negatively affecting their grades. As it turns out, the teachers were a lot more generous than the algorithm. And then what kind of fairness does exams themselves prioritise? There's some consensus around exams that that's how we do it. So perhaps we don't subject exams to the same degree of scrutiny as we do these other methods for determining performance. But of course we know that exam outcomes reflect social disadvantage. They're affected by huge variation of a pupil's situation on the day of the exam. But there's something about exams, that controlled and timed individual performance, that somehow seems fairer to a lot of people. But we also have to remember that that's actually quite a recent outcome, that since GOES reforms of the last kind of 5 years plus to remove coursework and to really prioritise that kind of that exam performance as the best measure. But one of the things that this highlights is that how the off-qual algorithm tried to insert individual pupils into the predictions, the models that they built based on previous data, is not a unique situation. This is not the only time that this happens, that all the school data practices, those anticipatory data logics that were going on within the school, also worked to shape pupils present through their intensive tracking, through that prediction, through that intervention of trying to fit pupils to models that had been derived from previous data patterns, and therefore are similarly working to close down rather than open up the possible futures, and thereby limiting the fairness, the opportunities for fairness of new and different things emerging. And this also, I think, illustrates how the calls for transparency that we often see when we see problems about data harms are really not sufficient. The off-qual algorithm was eventually revealed and was reasonably transparent, and so we could actually see how those calculations were made and we could open them up to scrutiny, but that wasn't really the issue. So these calls for transparency are insufficient. Really, this is a question about politics and about priorities and how we represent those through data. So I'm going to attempt to finish on a more positive note, thinking about what fairer data futures might look like. And I don't really pretend to have the answer here, but some possible ideas for directions that might be worth exploring. I think we have to start with lowering the stakes of any single data point, that the amount of weight that we place on end of school exams is always going to lead to gaming and is always going to lead to unfairness when we place so much on such a limited range of information about a pupil. I would like to see a multiplicity of data points. So rather than seeing pupils summed up by really just a few grades, actually let's have lots that we can't reduce people to just a few limited grades. Let's say, well, if you want to look at one aspect, you need this data. If you want to look at another aspect, you need this data. Let's explode and expand the data that we use to describe people and their educational experience. And let's think about the uncertainty that's within data descriptions and data representations. We often treat data as if it's monolithic and as if it's completely objective. And once it's there and it can't be argued with. And of course, what you see when you look up close at how data gets made is the compromises, the decisions, the workarounds that go in to produce any particular data point. We need to engage with that uncertainty rather than try and smooth it out. And perhaps, as the Doing Data Differently project has also explored in different ways, we could engage with more creative ways about how we represent data about pupils in more dynamic and more emergent ways. Again, trying to break up the monolithic way in which data about learning and about education is represented. But I think perhaps finally we have to also recognise that any system, any large-scale education system that attempts to sort and rank pupils or even countries by grades is going to include compromises on fairness. So I'm going to stop there, and I look forward to the panel happening next week and to some engagement around this fascinating topic. And thanks again for inviting me to be part of it.